In the bitter dark before sunrise, Gefreiter Klaus Zimmermann fought to keep his numb hands steady as he tried to split 6 precious cigarettes among 8 exhausted soldiers. He whispered numbers to himself, attempting to perform fractions in the freezing gloom, while the low roll of American artillery echoed somewhere beyond the tree line. Berlin had promised the men of the Ardennes offensive extra rations and special provisions for what was meant to be Hitler's final breakthrough. Instead, his squad now found itself rationing tobacco like paupers dividing the last scraps of a meal. 6 cigarettes for 8 men. Tomorrow, if fortune was unusually kind, the supply truck might bring 5, assuming it had fuel, assuming it had not been intercepted by Allied fighter bombers, assuming it arrived at all. Barely 20 meters away, hidden beneath a thin crust of snow, lay the body of an American infantryman killed the previous afternoon. When Zimmermann had searched his pockets, he discovered something that left him stunned. 3 untouched packs of Lucky Strikes, 60 cigarettes in total, along with chocolate, chewing gum, and packets of instant coffee. That single corpse carried more comforts than Zimmermann's entire company had seen in months. And this small, jarring discovery would prove to be only the first sign of a much larger truth, one that would erode German morale long before Allied forces broke their lines. Zimmermann could not have known that only a few kilometers away, American wartime industry was producing cigarettes on a scale that defied imagination, roughly 290 billion a year for military consumption, while the Hershey Company alone turned out 24 million chocolate bars every week for U.S. troops. It was in the pockets of the dead, not in briefing rooms, that the real comparison between 2 industrial systems was being made. The gulf between American abundance and German scarcity was being measured 1 stick of gum, 1 chocolate bar, 1 cigarette at a time. By late 1944, the rationing system of the Wehrmacht functioned more as a theoretical model than a reliable supply plan. On paper, each German soldier was supposed to receive a reasonable daily allotment, about 3/4 of a kilogram of bread, a modest amount of butter or fat, a small serving of sausage or cheese, a portion of meat when it could be obtained, and, notably, 7 cigarettes, or 2 cigars, per day. Regulations capped the free tobacco issue at 6 cigarettes daily, though even this ceiling became irrelevant as deliveries dwindled to almost nothing. These official rations, established in 1939, had been repeatedly reduced as the war turned against Germany. Even the original guidelines revealed how profoundly the Reich had misjudged the industrial demands of modern warfare. An entry from May 1944 in the diary of Obergefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann, serving with the 352nd Infantry Division in Normandy, captured the situation clearly. Hoffmann recalled asking a supply sergeant about the daily 6-cigarette allowance. The sergeant had laughed. The unit had received only 6 cigarettes per week for 2 months, and those had been French brands seized in 1940, so dry and ancient that they disintegrated when touched by flame. Research conducted later by historian Robert N. Proctor into surviving German records revealed the broader pattern. By 1944, roughly 87% of German service personnel were habitual smokers, yet their consumption had dropped by nearly a quarter due to extreme shortages. 2/3 of Germany's tobacco factories had been taken offline by 1942, converted to armaments production. Even the SS, whose leadership had publicly denounced smoking, provided its frontline units with a minimal allowance, 1.5 cigarettes per day, 6 cigarettes issued for every 4-day combat ration, justified as essential for nerves under fire. The American K-Ration represented the opposite end of the logistical spectrum. It was the culmination of industrial mass production applied directly to soldier welfare. Each day's set contained 3 separate meal units, and with each came a suite of comfort items packaged alongside more than 3,500 calories of food. 4 cigarettes per meal unit, 12 per day without exception. Chocolate bars, at first a solid 2-ounce slab and later divided into smaller portions. Chewing gum, usually 2 sticks. Instant coffee, sugar tablets, and even a small supply of toilet paper. The cigarettes, Camel, Lucky Strike, Chesterfield, Philip Morris, were fresh, carefully sealed in waterproof packaging, and accompanied by matches. In the frozen woods of the Ardennes, Zimmerman could not have articulated the industrial arithmetic behind the Battle of the Bulge. But as he stared at the American soldiers' pockets filled with luxuries, he understood instinctively what those cigarettes meant. One army inhabited a world of scarcity, the other a world of unimaginable surplus. The outcome of the campaign, perhaps even the war itself, was already written in that disparity. In a 1944 assessment for the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, Major Robert Johnson emphasized that items such as cigarettes and candy were far more than small comforts. They functioned, he wrote, as morale stabilizers, fast energy sources, and universal barter tools in every liberated region. He calculated the daily cost of these personal items, 47 cents per serviceman, and pointed out that the United States was prepared to sustain this expense for more than 11 million troops every single day. Behind such allocations lay the reality of two vastly different wartime economies. By 1943, American tobacco manufacturers had essentially transformed themselves into arms of the military supply system. Their production figures were staggering. The American Tobacco Company was turning out about 75 billion cigarettes a year. R.J. Reynolds contributed an additional 60 billion. Liggett & Myers produced around 50 billion more. Civilian consumers became a secondary priority, as nearly the entire industry focused on the armed forces. Troops could purchase extra cigarettes in military exchanges for as little as $0.50 per carton. Germany, by contrast, entered 1944 with annual production of roughly 40 billion cigarettes, and the Wehrmacht had to share that limited supply with a civilian population of nearly 80 million. Numerically, the comparison was devastating. The United States generated more than 7 times the number of cigarettes Germany produced, while still maintaining high civilian availability and better troop distribution.
Captured German staff officer Hauptmann Friedrich Becker later explained the psychological impact to American interrogators. "We calculated for everything: shells, fuel, armor. We never thought to calculate cigarettes or chocolate. Those numbers told us who was destined to win." Chocolate made the contrast even sharper. At its peak, Hershey's military output reached 24 million bars every single week, surpassing the total annual production of the entire German confectionery industry. Hershey engineers designed the famous D-ration bar, a 4-ounce slab of fortified chocolate mixed with oats, capable of surviving extreme heat and delivering 600 calories. Between 1940 and 1945, the company produced more than 3 billion bars for the U.S. military, earning multiple Army-Navy E awards. Milton Hershey himself insisted that chocolate provided a soldier with a piece of home and a small comfort in the middle of chaos. On the Eastern Front, where Germany's armies were being crushed by 1943, the ration system had collapsed completely. Gertrader Hans Müller of the 6th Army wrote to his sister just before the fall of Stalingrad, "If we receive 6 cigarettes twice a week, we consider ourselves fortunate. When we capture Russian trenches, we search their dead, not for documents, but for makorka. We roll it in scraps of Pravda, communist paper for German smoke." Feldwebel Kurt Weber of the 4th Panzer Army recounted an incident that highlighted the gulf between the two sides. His unit seized an Allied supply drop meant for Soviet forces, crates filled with Spam, Maxwell House coffee, Lucky Strikes, and Hershey bars. "The Americans were supplying the Russians better than Germany supplied its own frontline troops," he wrote. "We fought over single chocolate bars while opening crates that held more cigarettes than our regiment had received in months." The Lend-Lease program had indeed delivered billions of cigarettes and tens of thousands of tons of processed foods, including chocolate and coffee, to the Soviet Union. American industrial power was so immense that it could simultaneously sustain its own military with unprecedented abundance while providing its allies with luxuries most German soldiers had never seen. The Italian campaign of 1943-1944 became the first prolonged period in which soldiers of the German Wehrmacht confronted the sheer material scale of American logistics. As German formations withdrew northward through the peninsula, they repeatedly passed through areas recently held by U.S. forces and encountered supply arrangements that defied their expectations. German doctrine, shaped by years of rationing and improvisation, had no conceptual framework for the volume and casual abundance that characterized the American war effort.
In early February 1944, Lieutenant Joachim Richter of the 1st Parachute Division, then fighting near Monte Cassino, recorded his frustrations in his field diary. He noted that U.S. artillery barrages expended more shells in a single hour than his own regiment received during a typical week. Yet what weighed on morale even more, he wrote, was what German troops found when they entered abandoned American positions: piles of used candy wrappers, empty cigarette packs, and partially eaten canned rations. To Richter, these leftovers represented a level of material comfort that Germans could scarcely imagine. They discard, he wrote, more than we receive. The psychological effect grew stronger when Wehrmacht soldiers stumbled upon American supply installations. German depots were normally concealed, tightly controlled, and chronically short of basic items. In contrast, American stores appeared almost limitless. A single captured U.S. quartermaster truck could contain more luxury items, cigarettes, candy, tinned fruit, than a German battalion might be issued in an entire month. Unteroffizier Franz Hartmann, who served in the Anzio sector, later described how his unit found a deserted American storage site containing what seemed like endless stacks of K-Ration crates. Every box included cigarettes and chocolate, items that had long since ceased to be routine for German troops. Hartmann calculated that the small site, apparently considered insignificant by the Americans, held more cigarettes than his entire division had received since the start of the Italian campaign. His men eagerly stuffed every available pocket, bread bag, and spare container with Lucky Strikes and Hershey bars. For 2 weeks, they smoked nothing else. When the last of their American treasure was gone, and they returned to their meager official ration of 6 cigarettes a day, when the ration arrived at all, some soldiers broke down from disappointment. The disparity became even more blatant after D-Day. As Allied units surged ashore Normandy, they brought with them a logistics framework unprecedented in scale. Operation Overlord delivered not only ammunition and medical supplies, but millions of non-essential items intended to sustain soldier morale. During the first week of the invasion, for example, more than 14 million cigarettes and nearly 1 million chocolate bars were landed on the beaches. Grenadier Joseph Wagner of the German 21st Panzer Division described the remains of American paratrooper supply drops scattered across the fields and hedgerows of Normandy. It seemed as if every American that landed, he wrote, carried enough cigarettes to open a small shop. Some containers held entire cartons, an unimaginable luxury for German infantrymen whose companies routinely went weeks without receiving their full tobacco allotment. Wagner noted with bitterness that the Americans carried chocolate bars that resisted melting, while German troops survived on an emergency iron ration consisting of a tin of meat processed years earlier. The psychological toll on German units was significant. Feldwebel Heinrich Schmidt of the 352nd Infantry Division reported that his men increasingly volunteered for patrols not to gather intelligence, but to search fallen American soldiers for cigarettes and chocolate. He lamented that a single dead American could provide more comfort goods than the German supply chain. He concluded, "This is no longer war, but rich men fighting the poor." The U.S. replacement system further demoralized the defenders. While German formations dwindled from attrition, lack of fuel, and shortages of the most basic supplies, American forces continuously received new troops, each replacement arriving with complete field rations, full tobacco issues, and pockets filled with sweets. German soldiers watched in disbelief as Americans tossed aside partially crushed cigarette packs, while Wehrmacht men painstakingly straightened bent stubs scavenged from the dirt. Major Karl von Rune, serving as a logistics officer with the Panzer Lehr Division, tried to quantify the imbalance. In his journal, he estimated that a single American infantry division in Normandy smoked around 130,000 cigarettes every day. This meant that one U.S. division consumed more tobacco than 3 fully supplied German divisions combined, if those divisions had received their official allowance, which many had not for over 2 years. Chocolate, in particular, carried enormous emotional weight. In German culture, it symbolized celebration, prosperity, and childhood normalcy. By 1944, however, genuine chocolate had all but vanished from the civilian market. Ersatz substitutes, made from roasted barley, artificial flavoring, and fat of uncertain origin, sold at outrageous prices on the black market. For many German soldiers, the taste of real chocolate had faded into memory. American troops, by contrast, treated chocolate as commonplace. The early D-ration bar was intentionally crafted to be barely palatable, designed as an emergency food. Later, tropical bars were engineered to withstand high temperatures without melting. By late 1944, some American field rations even included familiar commercial candy bars like Milky Way or the heat-resistant Mars Torrid Zone bar. In the Hürtgen forest, Gefreiter Paul Zimmermann found an abandoned American position strewn with empty or half-eaten chocolate wrappers. The sight overwhelmed him. He later wrote that his hands trembled as he gathered the scraps, licking the remaining traces of chocolate from the inside like a starving animal. He had not tasted authentic chocolate since 1941. To many German prisoners and civilians, the waste they witnessed in American camps was almost unimaginable. Items that their own families would have treated as prized luxuries were casually discarded by American troops. Nowhere was this contrast clearer than in the American military's massive chocolate initiative, a program that embodied the U.S.'s unique combination of industrial power and attention to soldier morale. Hershey was only one participant in this effort. Mars operated enormous production lines, turning out millions of specialized rations each week, while Nestle contributed an additional flood of chocolate products tailored for military distribution. The Quartermaster Corps had concluded early in the war that chocolate offered one of the most efficient combinations of nutrition and portability. Dense caloric content, long shelf life, and a strong psychological effect made it an ideal addition to field rations. Colonel James Harrison summarized the philosophy behind the program in a 1944 memorandum, emphasizing that a simple chocolate bar could momentarily pull a soldier out of the psychological landscape of war. A man who tastes chocolate, even briefly, feels restored. For that instant, he is reminded of home and of the society that supports him. This mental shift strengthens his ability to keep fighting in a way that calories alone cannot measure. German servicemen grew increasingly aware that nothing comparable existed in their own system. The Wehrmacht tended to treat its personnel as expendable mechanisms to be maintained at the lowest acceptable level. In contrast, the American military invested significant resources in making its soldiers feel human, valued, and connected to the nation behind them. These differing philosophies, made visible through small luxuries like cigarettes and chocolate, weakened German morale more effectively than any Allied leaflet campaign. By the end of 1944, American cigarettes had become the unofficial currency of occupied Europe. A single packet of Lucky Strikes to purchase a chicken. A full carton might buy a bicycle. German soldiers whose pay had lost purchasing power routinely sought out French and Belgian black market traders to acquire American cigarettes, products that U.S. troops often gave away or exchanged simply because they had more than they needed. Hans Dietrich, a German non-commissioned writer stationed in Belgium, described the humiliation in a letter dated September 1944. He found himself spending more than a day's wages on cigarettes that local farmers had obtained freely from American soldiers. "The children here receive as gifts what we treat as treasure," he wrote, noting the symbolic collapse of German economic credibility. These experiences reflected a larger structural truth. Even with Albert Speer's organizational reforms and remarkable production increases, the German war economy struggled merely to keep frontline units supplied with basic munitions. Non-essential items, cigarettes, sweets, and other comforts had been sacrificed entirely to the doctrine of total war. In contrast, the American industrial system was producing both a vast arsenal and huge quantities of consumer-type goods at the same time. The production statistics of 1944 illustrated the imbalance with brutal clarity. The United States manufactured roughly 500,000 military trucks, 96,000 aircraft, 17,000 tanks, and nearly 300 billion cigarettes, most of which were set aside for civilians in an attempt to preserve stability on the home front. The ratios spoke for themselves. The United States could sustain abundance, while Germany struggled to sustain existence. American supply operations supporting frontline soldiers became legendary for their efficiency. Their logistics system, stretching from the factory floor to the forward line, functioned with a level of coordination that astonished German officers who studied it. Every day, ships departed American ports carrying millions of tons of material. Liberty ships, built at unprecedented speed in American shipyards, delivered everything from heavy armor to simple comfort items such as candy bars. Once those cargoes reached ports in Britain or France, they flowed into a distribution network that often seemed impervious to the usual disruptions of war. Heidemann Erich Weiss, a German logistics officer captured in France, later recounted an interrogation in which American personnel asked him detailed questions about German supply chains. When Weiss described the shortages, delays, and improvisations that defined German logistics, the Americans reacted with genuine confusion. One of them finally asked, "Then how do your men receive cigarettes regularly?" When Weiss explained that such regularity did not exist, the interrogator's expression conveyed sympathy more than superiority. The most famous symbol of American logistical power was the Red Ball Express, the non-stop trucking corridor that kept supplies flowing from the Normandy beaches to the rapidly advancing front. From August 25 to November 16, 1944, this remarkable system transported more than 412,000 tons of material across routes that sometimes stretched 750 miles one way. At its peak, nearly 6,000 vehicles were operating at once, and 3/4 of the 23,000 drivers were African American soldiers serving in segregated units. On August 29 alone, the convoy delivered a record load of more than 12,000 tons. In stark contrast, German trucks, when they had fuel at all, made infrequent, hazardous trips, carrying only the most essential ammunition and medical supplies. Lieutenant Robert Mason, one of the Red Ball Express drivers, later recalled unloading crates of ammunition directly beside boxes of cigarettes and candy. Both were treated as essential, he explained, one for fighting, the other for keeping men steady enough to fight. The disparity reached its most visible point during the winter of 1944–45. At the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge, launched on December 16, German troops broke through Allied lines and captured several American supply caches. The abundance they found shocked them, a level of provisioning far beyond anything they themselves received. In many cases, German units slowed their advance because soldiers paused to steal rations, warm clothing, and luxury goods from American stockpiles. Hitler had committed more than 200,000 troops to his last major offensive in the Ardennes. Yet part of the operation's eventual collapse stemmed from this unexpected distraction. Troops accustomed to scarcity were overwhelmed by the temptation of Allied supplies. In the midst of the Reich's final gamble, German soldiers were confronted with physical evidence of the very imbalance that had doomed them, an enemy capable of waging war and maintaining comfort at the same time.
When the Ardennes offensive began, Gefreiter Friedrich Bauer, pushing forward with the 1st SS Panzer Division, captured an American field kitchen that was still warm from use. In his later account, Bauer described stumbling into what felt less like a military emplacement and more like a well-stocked roadside cafe. The coffee, real coffee, was still percolating, he wrote. Crates of K-Rations were stacked like bricks, each with cigarettes and chocolate packed inside. There was fresh bread, canned fruit. We ate until we were nauseated and filled our pockets to overflowing.
Our squad leader shook his head and muttered that we weren't defeating the Americans, we were looting their supermarket. The effect spread across entire formations. German troops paused advances, not for tactical advantage, but to gorge themselves on captured American provisions. What began as opportunistic scavenging soon became a psychological revelation. Soldiers saw with their own eyes that the U.S. Army could lose mountains of supplies and remain unfazed, while their own units operated on rations that could barely sustain a marching pace. The contrast between the two armies was no longer theoretical. It was visceral, tasted in chocolate and inhaled in cigarette smoke. Feldwebel Otto Kraus later recalled discovering the remains of a destroyed American supply truck. Artillery had torn apart the vehicle, killing the driver, but the cargo, boxes of cigarettes, tins of food, cartons of coffee, candy bars, lay scattered across the snow. "We behaved like starving dogs," he admitted. Veterans with 5 years of frontline service fought over chocolate like children. The American driver, dead in the road, carried more cigarettes in his uniform pockets than I had seen in half a year. When German units grappled with scarcity, American troops trapped in Bastogne enjoyed a level of resupply that bordered on surreal. Encircled and vastly outnumbered, they still received parachute bundles containing not only ammunition and bandages, but also the usual cigarettes and chocolate. The defenders smoked without hesitation as their besiegers stretched their last bits of tobacco into thin, rationed fragments. Even in the middle of a brutal winter siege, American abundance persisted. The psychological shock intensified when German soldiers began surrendering in large numbers. The moment they entered American POW camps, many discovered that their enemy was prepared to feed and supply them better than their own army ever had. U.S. prison facilities provided meals that met military nutritional standards, complete with the same cigarettes and chocolate included in American rations. Unteroffizier Wolfgang Mayer, captured during the Battle of the Bulge, described the disbelief of his first days in captivity. The Americans issued each prisoner 5 cigarettes a day. That was only one less than our official military ration, which we had not received in months. They apologized because chocolate was limited to twice a week. They apologized. We had not tasted chocolate in years, and they regretted offering it to us only 2 times per week.
Even after Germany surrendered in May 1945, when German POWs were officially redesignated as disarmed enemy forces to sidestep Geneva Convention requirements, their rations in American custody often exceeded what they had eaten on active duty. One prisoner recalled gaining from 128 to 185 pounds during his time in a U.S. camp. Another wrote about being offered a choice between Coca-Cola and ice cream at Fort Lewis, luxuries that many American civilians themselves could not obtain because of wartime rationing. These experiences were not isolated. Prisoners wrote home describing this unexpected abundance, and although their letters passed through censors, the most essential truths remained intact. A quiet psychological warfare unfolded through these messages. "We eat better here as prisoners than we did as soldiers," one wrote to his family. Another concluded, "The Americans possess so much that they can afford generosity even to their enemies." Such admissions carried more weight than any Allied propaganda leaflet. Back in Germany, civilians survived on shrinking rations. The cigarette allowance for the public had been cut to 3 per day by 1944, then to 2, and soon became theoretical as supplies vanished entirely. Women under 25 and over 55 were removed from tobacco rationing lists altogether. Chocolate disappeared except for top party officials. In the final months of the war, many city dwellers lived on a caloric intake barely above starvation levels, between 1,000 and 1,670 calories a day, depending on the region. Gefreite Hermann Wolf received a letter from his wife in the ruins of Berlin. "Little Klaus keeps asking when his father will bring chocolate home," she wrote. "I tell him after the war. He asks me when that will be. I have no answer." Wolf's weekly ration had amounted to 4 cigarettes. He traded them for a quarter kilo of potatoes. Meanwhile, American troops routinely mailed home care packages filled with items unimaginable to German families. The U.S. postal system handled millions of parcels from soldiers to relatives, many containing chocolates, gum, or cartons of cigarettes, items that had effectively vanished from the German home front. The disparity extended far beyond the battlefield. It was a reflection of two vastly different economic systems colliding in total war. Private First Class Tommy Rodriguez wrote from Europe to his mother in Texas, "Sending you some German money as souvenirs and a couple of chocolate bars. Don't need them. We get plenty. Trade the cigarettes I'm sending for something nice for yourself and Dad." For a German household in 1944, such casual abundance might as well have belonged to another universe.
Behind every ration pack, every can of fruit, every cigarette handed out in PAW camps lay the enormous machinery of American industrial power. The same assembly lines that built B-17 bombers also produced chocolate bars. The factories that churned out Liberty ships also churned out millions of cigarette packs. The organizational skill that orchestrated the Normandy invasion also ensured that comfort items reached soldiers in frozen foxholes. In the end, it wasn't only weapons or strategy that shaped morale, it was the cold, tangible difference between plenty and scarcity, measured one cigarette and one chocolate bar at a time. By the middle of 1944, the scale of American wartime manufacturing had reached levels that other nations could barely imagine. U.S. factories were producing consumer comfort supplies in quantities that rivaled the output of entire European industries. Military procurement records list almost 300 billion cigarettes a year, more than 3 billion Hershey chocolate bars, billions of K-Ration accessory packets, and astronomical quantities of coffee and chewing gum. Even the combined industrial capacity of Germany could not approach the American production of non-essential goods, let alone compete with the United States in armaments and heavy equipment. The Wehrmacht found itself attempting to wage a modern mechanized war while the enemy fought with what appeared to be a post-scarcity arsenal. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, questioned after the war, admitted with blunt clarity that the Germans had misjudged the true indicators of industrial power. He told interrogators, "We counted tanks and battalions, but we never thought to measure cigarettes or chocolate. Those figures revealed the true imbalance. America fought a global war without depriving its people. We could not even nourish our own men in the field." American psychologists had quantified morale with scientific precision. Research conducted for the Army revealed that soldiers who regularly received cigarettes performed measurably better in sustained combat, while access to chocolate reduced exhaustion and stress symptoms. To the U.S. Quartermaster Corps, such items were not luxuries, but mathematical components of combat effectiveness. Major David Eisenstadt summarized the principle: "A soldier who trusts that tomorrow will bring the same small comforts fights with a fundamentally different state of mind, one grounded in confidence rather than resignation." German troops understood this contrast with painful clarity. They served a system that demanded obedience and sacrifice, but offered little comfort in return. Each missing ration item became a symbolic reminder of their expendability. As one lieutenant, Friedrich Hoffmann, wrote in his diary, "The Americans enter battle with chocolate in their pockets because their country wants them to feel human. We enter with ideology because that is all our country can afford." Ideology, in the end, proved weaker than chocolate. By early 1945, black market exchange rates across occupied Europe illustrated Germany's collapse more starkly than any battlefield map. A single American cigarette was worth 5 German ones. A Hershey bar could be traded for a Wehrmacht ceremonial dagger. Entire cartons of Lucky Strikes were exchanged for pistols. German soldiers routinely bartered their gear for American treats, a quiet admission of where true value, and thus true power, now resided. Scenes across occupied towns reinforced this psychological shift. Small gestures by American soldiers, handing chocolate to children or offering cigarettes to elderly civilians, had an impact far greater than force of arms. Germans encountering these gifts saw,
often for the first time, the sheer abundance their enemy enjoyed. Unteroffizier Karl Zimmermann recalled watching a U.S. private give an entire K-ration to a hungry child. That moment contained more chocolate than most German families had seen in years, he noted. The mother wept not from shame, but because a foreign soldier could show generosity our own leaders never could. Master Sergeant Bill Patterson of the 29th Infantry Division kept meticulous supply notes that would later become part of the National Archives. His entries reveal how routine abundance was for American units, even in the war's harshest months. In Belgium, he recorded distributing 45,000 cigarettes in a single day, followed by complaints from soldiers who preferred Lucky Strikes over Philip Morris. Damaged chocolate bars were burned rather than issued. Nearby German POWs reportedly cried watching them destroyed. When thousands of cigarettes were lost to a mine explosion, the next day's replacement shipment required nothing more than a simple requisition. In contrast, Patterson's description of a captured German depot near the Rhine bordered on tragic. A few crates of stale French cigarettes from 1940, no chocolate, no coffee, and ersatz tea. The stockpile had been intended to supply an entire regiment for a month. As Patterson dryly noted, his division issued more to a single company in a single day what lacked money. German attempts to mimic American comfort goods only underscored their industrial limitations. Dr. Vera Schreiber, a chemist involved in producing ersatz chocolate, later admitted that the results were dismal. Substitute bars were made from roasted grains and artificial sweeteners, barely edible and nutritionally weak. Tobacco substitutes were similarly crude, shredded leaves or improvised botanicals that produced smoke but little satisfaction. She explained, the Americans applied real science to their soldiers' morale. They developed chocolate that could survive desert heat and cigarettes that stayed fresh in jungle humidity. We, who prided ourselves on scientific excellence, could not provide our troops with proper chocolate or decent tobacco. Operation Varsity, launched on 24 March 1945, during the Allied assault across the Rhine, became the clearest demonstration of how the United States wielded its logistical superiority. In this single largest airborne deployment conducted in one day, more than 16,000 paratroopers descended on German territory. The American 17th Airborne Division contributed 9,387 of them, while the British 6th Airborne Division added 7,220. What distinguished the mission was not only its military audacity, but the unusual directive issued before takeoff. Each paratrooper was to carry extra cigarettes and chocolate, not primarily for themselves, but to pass out to German civilians once they landed. Material comfort had been weaponized, an intentional strategy to soften resistance among exhausted populations.
Private James MacArthur of the 17th Airborne later explained that the troops were briefed to expect hungry children and wary adults. We packed spare chocolate bars to hand out to youngsters. Command said it would calm nerves and reduce the chance civilians might turn us in. And it did. Kids who might have warned German soldiers about our positions showed up instead asking for candy. Their parents approached us for cigarettes. We advanced through generosity as much as through gunfire. German defensive units, especially ill-equipped formations of the Volkssturm, many consisting of elderly men and adolescents, witnessed American troops treating what Germans considered rare luxuries as everyday items. For many of these last-ditch defenders, the last time they had tasted actual chocolate was a distant memory. Some had never tasted it at all. Meanwhile, U.S. paratroopers casually complained about the monotony of their K-Rations. One German writer, Franz Müller, recorded a final note in his journal shortly before surrendering. The Americans draw near while smoking and eating chocolate, as though strolling through a park. We possess neither ammunition nor tobacco. The fighting is finished. It ended the moment our enemies could snack during battle, while we had nothing left. The Ruhr Pocket. Supply shock at the end of the war. The encirclement of Army Group B in the Ruhr Pocket
from 1 to 18 April 1945, exposed the most extreme contrast in provisioning during the war's final weeks. On 1 April, Allied forces sealed the pocket near Lippstadt, trapping 317,000 German troops. Inside the shrinking perimeter, soldiers rationed crumbs and scrounged for anything combustible. Outside, American units continued to receive uninterrupted deliveries, including non-essential comforts. General Lieutenant Fritz Behrlein, formerly of the Panzer Lehr Division, recounted his experience negotiating surrender terms. During the meeting, an American officer offered him not a single cigarette, but an entire pack, telling him to keep it. Behrlein had not seen a full, intact packet in 2 years. The Americans smoked steadily throughout the discussion, extinguishing half-finished cigarettes on the ground. To the German general, each crushed cigarette represented more tobacco than many of his men had been issued for weeks.
American psychological operations teams seized upon this disparity. Loudspeakers broadcast taunts into German lines. "We drink hot coffee and eat warm meals while you starve. Every American soldier has cigarettes and chocolate. Lay down your arms and you will eat today." The messages were convincing precisely because German troops knew they described reality. When the Ruhr pocket collapsed on 18 April, the exact figure of 317,000 prisoners entered Allied custody, more than American forces had taken during the entire North African campaign. Civilians experience an unimaginable abundance. A witness to liberation, Hans-Peter Richter, aged 12 at the time, later described the shock civilians felt. He wrote of watching the first American soldier he encountered strolling through his village with a chocolate bar, eating it with complete nonchalance. Richter had gone without chocolate for half a decade. The soldier, noticing the boy staring, broke the bar in half and handed it to him. That single portion exceeded the chocolate his family had seen in years. Richter hurried home weeping with excitement, gripping the piece as though it were a precious metal. His mother divided it carefully so every family member could taste a sliver. His younger sister, born in 1942, experienced chocolate for the first time and asked whether this was what victory tasted like. Their mother responded that it was indeed the taste of the winners. After the fighting ended, American occupation authorities incorporated comfort item distribution directly into governance. Empty trucks returning from the front were filled with cigarettes and chocolate rather than left unused, a practice known as backhauling. German adults received regular cigarette rations from the U.S. military government, often more than the Nazi state had been able to provide during the later war years. Children queued for chocolate giveaways that surpassed anything their parents had imagined possible during the shortages of the 1940s.
Colonel Frank Howley, commanding the American sector in Berlin, remarked, "Control is exercised as much through Hershey bars and cigarettes as through military authority. A German child holding an American chocolate bar, an adult smoking American tobacco, these things signal acceptance of defeat more clearly than any proclamation. Comfort succeeds where propaganda does not." Economists analyzing American assistance after the war were stunned. The chocolate handed out freely to German children in 1945 exceeded Germany's total confectionery output from 1943 to 1945 combined. The cigarettes distributed to German POWs were greater than the quantity issued to Wehrmacht combat units during the entire final year of the war. Professor Ludwig Erhard, who would later engineer West Germany's post-war economic transformation, studied the figures carefully. His conclusion was stark. The Allies had prevailed not solely through superior firepower, but through an economic capacity so vast that they could give away what Germany had struggled even to manufacture. The distribution of American consumer goods drove home the lesson that Germany's wartime economy had failed at a fundamental structural level. A former enemy's reflection on abundance and defeat.
At a 1985 reunion of the 82nd Airborne Division, former Feldwebel Kurt Muller, who had immigrated to the United States after the war, spoke candidly before the American veterans. "You defeated us," he said, "not only by destroying our armies, but by overwhelming us with things we could not dream of possessing. Every ration we captured, every pack of cigarettes your soldiers carried, showed us how hopeless our situation was. You had so much that you could be generous. We had so little that cruelty became necessity. The moment I found American cigarettes on paratroopers at Normandy, I understood Germany could not win. A nation that equips every soldier with chocolate and tobacco will not be beaten by a nation that cannot." A letter that never reached its recipient. Among German archives, historians later found a letter penned by Frau Elisabeth Hoffmann to her son, Lieutenant Paul Hoffmann, in March 1945. She described how American troops entering their village offered chocolate to young Anna, who devoured it so quickly she became ill. An American medic provided treatment and then gave her more chocolate, advising her to eat it slowly. Her husband traded his Iron Cross from the First World War to American soldiers in hopes of receiving a few cigarettes. The Americans laughed and handed him entire cartons, joking that the metal was far more valuable than the tobacco.
"They told us the Americans were weak and decadent," she wrote. "They are neither. They possess more than we can imagine. The war was lost the moment they could afford to show kindness to their enemies." Paul never saw her message. He had surrendered 2 weeks earlier when his unit ran out of ammunition, food, and finally cigarettes, a sequence that reflected the morale priorities of countless German soldiers. The statistical reality behind the psychological collapse. Post-war audits revealed staggering figures. Between 1941 and 1945, American industry produced 1.2 trillion cigarettes for military use, a peak output of 950 million cigarettes per day, roughly 10,000 cigarettes per service member per year. 45 different brands supplied at 5 cents per pack. Chocolate production was equally immense. 3 billion Hershey military bars. Weekly output reaching 24 million bars. Over 20 million pounds of chocolate delivered to U.S. forces annually. Around 600 chocolate calories per soldier each day. German output during the same period appeared minuscule in comparison. 175 billion cigarettes total, civilian and military. About 40 billion reserved for the armed forces. Approximately 10 million pounds of chocolate annually for the entire nation. Virtually no military chocolate after 1942. Only a fraction of tobacco factories functioning by mid-war. The comparison mirrored what German soldiers had witnessed firsthand among wrecked vehicles and captured supply posts. The United States fought a global war while still maintaining comforts surpassing Germany's peacetime standards. A final German assessment. Shortly before taking his own life in April 1945, Field Marshal Walter Model drafted an unsent final statement. In it, he argued that Germany's leadership had misunderstood the relationship between deprivation and strength. They had assumed austerity would forge a tougher army, that hardship created resilience, and that creature comforts weakened resolve. The Americans, he wrote, proved the inverse. Well-supplied soldiers fought more confidently because they knew comfort awaited them. German troops, meanwhile, surrendered more readily when they understood that continued resistance meant only deeper scarcity. Model concluded that each American cigarette functioned like a small psychological weapon, each chocolate bar like an artillery round, not metaphorically, but in the way they eroded German morale. He finished with a bitter mathematical observation.
If every German soldier had received the 7 cigarettes per day originally promised, eventually reduced to 6 by regulation, Germany would have needed 13 billion cigarettes annually, a figure the Reich never came close to reaching. By the final year of the war, Germany's total output of cigarettes for both its armed forces and its civilian population scarcely surpassed what the United States was issuing to its troops in the matter of weeks. American factories produced, packaged, and shipped the same quantity roughly every 14 days, and they did so exclusively for military consumption. This imbalance was not simply numerical. It captured the widening gulf between two wartime economies moving in opposite directions. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann, a quartermaster in the Wehrmacht, taken prisoner in early 1945, later tried to quantify the scale of the disparity. His calculations led to an unavoidable conclusion. To provide its soldiers with anything approaching America's tobacco supply, Germany would have been forced to increase cigarette production 5-fold and simultaneously cut off all civilian access. As for matching American chocolate distribution, Hoffmann noted that it was not merely improbable, but mathematically impossible. The amount of cocoa required exceeded what German-occupied territories could ever supply. Industrial constraints made the idea of parity a fantasy. This contrast became symbolically and painfully clear when Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel signed Germany's unconditional surrender on 8 May 1945. After the ceremony, American officers offered the defeated delegation packs of American cigarettes. Keitel, a man whose identity had been built on Prussian austerity, accepted immediately. Witnesses recalled the moment as a distilled version of the war's outcome. The vanquished gratefully receiving comfort items from adversaries who possessed enough excess to share even with their former enemies. Captain Harry Butcher, an aide to General Eisenhower, wrote that the defeated Germans drew on the American cigarettes with the desperation of men who had been deprived of such luxuries for years. Keitel quietly slipped several packs inside his uniform jacket. These were once commanders of vast armies, now reduced to preserving whatever small tokens of American abundance they could. If a single scene proved total victory, it was their eagerness for something as ordinary as a carton of Lucky Strikes.
5 years later, in 1950, the memory of those final months lingered in unexpected ways. A school teacher in Hamburg, Germany, asking her class what they remembered most from the end of the war, received an answer she did not expect. 7-year-old Greta Mueller, who had been only a toddler when Allied forces arrived, recalled something she called the chocolate rain. She described American soldiers tossing chocolate bars from truck beds into crowds of children who chased after them with joy. Her older brother had told her that day marked the turning of the world back to its proper order, the moment when sweets fell from the sky instead of explosives. The teacher, Frau Hoffmann, a widow whose husband had died on the Eastern Front, wrote in her diary that evening that the children remembered American generosity more vividly than the collapse of their own nation. She concluded that perhaps the deepest lesson of the war was that material abundance defeats ideological rigidity, that a country willing and able to give chocolate to children who had been its enemies had already secured moral victory. Interviews conducted in the post-war years introduced an even more striking irony. Many German veterans, men who had fought relentlessly for National Socialism, endured the brutal campaigns of the Eastern Front, and maintained discipline in the face of overwhelming pressure, identified a specific moment when they first sensed the war was unwinnable. It was not the Allied landings in Normandy, nor the Soviet advance into the heart of Germany, nor the destruction wrought by Allied air fleets. Instead, they traced the realization to something far more mundane. The moment they discovered that American troops had a seemingly endless supply of cigarettes and chocolate, while they, the soldiers of a regime claiming racial and ideological superiority, had none.
It was the visible manifestation of a truth they could no longer ignore, that industrial abundance, not doctrine, determined the war's final shape. Hans von Luck, one of the most decorated officers in the Panzer forces, summarized this disillusionment in his memoirs. He wrote that German soldiers had been raised to see themselves as warriors of a superior people, destined to triumph through endurance and self-denial. Yet they had been defeated not by ideological weakness, but by the overwhelming productive capacity of a democratic society. He reflected that American soldiers, factory workers, farmers, mechanics, carried more cigarettes in their pockets than German generals could distribute to entire units. Each American chocolate bar signaled the economic strength behind it. Each absence of a German cigarette revealed the shortages hollowing out the Reich. In Luck's words, the war was decided not on the battlefield alone, but by the sheer weight of American supply chains. The statistical record left little room for debate. Between 1941 and 1945, American forces received approximately 1.2 trillion cigarettes, more than 5 billion chocolate bars, 500 million pounds of coffee, and roughly 100 million pieces of chewing gum. American soldiers averaged around 4,300 calories per day, with comfort items costing the U.S. government over $2 billion. Germany's numbers during the same period told the opposite story. Roughly 35 billion cigarettes distributed, most going to civilians in an attempt to preserve home front stability. Virtually no chocolate after 1942. Ersatz coffee replacing real coffee from 1941 onward, and an average soldier's daily caloric intake falling to around 1,800 calories by the war's final winter. By 1945, there was no budget at all for distributing comforts to the troops. German soldiers suffered a war of deprivation. Americans fought one supported by abundance. The image of Wehrmacht soldiers receiving 6 cigarettes a day, while American troops enjoyed chocolate in every K-ration, was more than an anecdote. It was the manifestation of two incompatible systems clashing, one built on scarcity and ideological resolve, the other on mass production and material confidence. Every German soldier who came into contact with American supplies, whether through captured depots, prison camp rations, or simple acts of generosity during occupation, confronted the same revelation. They had been sent to challenge a military sustained by the world's first truly mass-produced comfort economy, armed with little more than ration substitutes and slogans promising that spirit would overcome shortage. In the end, cigarettes and chocolate were not trivial luxuries. They were indicators of a deeper reality, that the United States fought the war with the power of a society capable of sustaining both military force and personal comfort on a global scale. What German soldiers encountered at the front lines, boxes of American cigarettes, stacks of chocolate bars, ample food, was the visible surface of an industrial machine far beyond their own nation's reach. The true lesson was embedded in every unopened pack of Lucky Strikes and every chocolate bar tucked into an American pack. That material abundance, sustained across continents, was the decisive factor in determining who won the most industrialized war in history.
America's ability to surround its soldiers with small comforts was not accidental. It emerged from an economic system capable of generating unimaginable volume. The United States Armed Forces distributed cigarettes, chocolate, coffee, gum, and countless other items simply because their factories could manufacture them in quantities large enough to make such generosity routine. Germany, by contrast, demanded austerity from its troops not out of ideological principle, but because its industrial network simply could not sustain anything beyond the bare minimum. For American servicemen, opening a ration pack and expecting a few cigarettes or a chocolate bar felt ordinary, almost guaranteed. These items had become an unspoken promise of the nation's manufacturing strength. German soldiers experienced the opposite reality. They had been conditioned to anticipate shortages, to assume nothing would arrive on time, and to regard basic comforts as rare windfalls rather than standard provisions. This disparity revealed a deeper truth about the war's direction long before the fighting ended.
While generals on both sides issued strategic directives and revised operational plans, the real determinants of victory were taking shape inside the factories and supply depots. War was increasingly defined not by ideology or battlefield heroism, but by the capacity to produce, ship, and replace. The contrast became painfully visible at the smallest level. A German infantryman attempting to stretch 6 cigarettes over a day, if he received his full allotment at all, while American troops casually tossed aside half-finished Lucky Strikes before moving on to the next pack. To a weary Wehrmacht soldier, the most striking symbol of American power was not a tank division or a bomber formation, but the casual abundance carried in the pockets of every captured GI. American chocolate appeared in all K-Rations not because it boosted morale, but because it was simple for American industry to manufacture millions of bars without strain. Germany filled its orders and speeches with ideological insistence because material goods were in short supply. Rhetoric was one of the few things the Reich could still produce in excess. In this quiet competition between material plenty and enforced deprivation, abundance proved the decisive force. A country that could consistently provide its soldiers with small comforts, food that did not run out, cigarettes that were always fresh, coffee that actually tasted like coffee, possessed an advantage that no amount of ideological fervor could negate. The imbalance was so stark that many German soldiers recognized the war's outcome long before the front collapsed. Their leaders spoke of willpower and destiny. Their own experiences told them that modern warfare obeyed the logic of factories, not slogans. Every German veteran who handled an American ration discovered a truth that propaganda could not conceal. The flavor of a Hershey bar or the scent rising from an American cigarette conveyed more about the future than any official communique. These items represented an industrial engine operating at a scale Germany could no longer match. They demonstrated in tangible form that the United States could supply abundance indefinitely, while Germany struggled to provide even adequacy. In the end, the final lesson of the conflict was written not in the ruins of cities or the signatures on surrender documents, but in the everyday objects filling American ration kits. Victory favored the nation that could effortlessly supply comfort, not the one that demanded hardship as a permanent condition. The German soldier who was promised 6 cigarettes a day and received far fewer learned this lesson gradually, one captured K-ration at a time, until the conclusion became undeniable. In a war defined by industrial capacity, the side that could manufacture abundance had already secured the future.